"You're dead when we get home." The words hit Deborah like a slap across the face, echoing through the upscale restaurant's quiet ambiance. Her boyfriend, Newton, was trembling with rage, his face contorted in fury as he spat the threat. All because a simple compliment from the waiter had given Deborah a fleeting moment of recognition, a moment of light, for which she was being punished. The dining room of the elite fusion restaurant grew eerily silent as every patron, whether they sat at the bar, nearby tables, or in the far corners, heard the chilling words. But not a single person moved. Not a single voice spoke up. They all stayed silent, because Deborah, sitting across from the man she once thought she loved, was alone in that moment. Alone, until one man, seated far away, decided to act. Jimin Kong, Seoul's most feared and influential mafia boss, rose from his seat and made his way across the room with a calm, calculated purpose. What he did next didn't just stop Newton in his tracks. It ended the man's reign of terror over Deborah, and gave her a future that had once seemed impossible. For the past 2 years, Deborah had been fading into the background of her own life. Her once vibrant personality, her dreams of success, and her art, all of it, had slowly vanished as Newton's control tightened around her like a vice. He'd pushed away her friends, isolated her from her family, and made her doubt every decision she made. Deborah, once strong and confident, had become a mere shadow of herself, silenced by fear and constant manipulation. That night at the high-end restaurant, where she had hoped to enjoy a quiet evening, everything came to a head. Newton's public threat, "You're dead when we get home," wasn't just a moment of rage. It was meant to be the final blow, the threat that would break her completely. But across the room, a figure watched, his gaze steady and intense. Jimin Kong, calm, collected, and powerful, sat alone. He heard Newton's words, and something inside him clicked. He'd seen it before, in the eyes of women like Deborah, and in his own past. Without hesitation, Jimin stood up, walked toward the chaos, and made a decision. No one was going to ignore this. Not tonight. Not Deborah. What started as a stranger's intervention would soon lead to an unexpected connection, a fierce protector, an unexpected ally, and a love powerful enough to restore everything Deborah had lost. This is the story of how Jimin Kong didn't just save a woman from her abuser. He gave her a second chance, a chance to reclaim her art, her life, and her freedom. Newton's hand slammed down on the table, rattling the wine glasses and sending a fork clattering to the floor. The sharp sound pierced through the low murmur of conversation that had cautiously resumed after his initial threat. "Don't you dare look away from me," he hissed, his fingers digging into Deborah's wrist across the white tablecloth. "You think I didn't see that? You think I'm stupid?" Deborah's throat constricted. She could feel the eyes of every diner burning into her back, yet no one moved. No one ever did. This was her reality: public humiliation wrapped in expensive dining, abuse dressed in designer clothes. "Newton, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't—" "You didn't what? Smile at him? Encourage him?" Newton's face was inches from hers now, his breath hot with wine and rage. "You're always doing this, always making me look like a fool." The familiar pattern was unfolding again. First the accusation, then the escalation, and finally, at home, the punishment. Deborah's mind raced through calculations: how to de-escalate, what to say, how to survive the night ahead. Her art studio flashed through her mind, the canvases she'd abandoned weeks ago because Newton said they took too much of her attention away from him. Then, a shadow fell across their table. "Excuse me." The voice was calm, measured, with a slight accent that carried an edge of authority. Newton's head snapped up, his expression shifting from rage to irritation. Jimin Kong stood beside their table, his posture relaxed but commanding. He was dressed impeccably in a black suit, his presence somehow both understated and impossible to ignore. His dark eyes moved from Newton to Deborah, lingering on her wrist where Newton's fingers still dug into her skin. "I think you need to leave," Newton said, his voice dripping with false bravado. He didn't release Deborah's wrist. Jimin didn't move. Instead, he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen twice, and held it up so only Newton could see. Deborah watched her boyfriend's face drain of color, the fury replaced by something she'd never seen before: fear. "What is—" Newton started, but his voice cracked. "I know exactly who you are, Newton Park," Jimin said quietly, his tone almost conversational. VP of Marketing at Hansol Corporation. You live at 42 Cheongdam-dong. Your father is on the board of directors. He paused, letting the information sink in. I also know that domestic violence charges tend to be very damaging to corporate careers in Seoul, especially when there's video evidence. Newton's hand finally released Deborah's wrist. She pulled her arm back, cradling it against her chest, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. You're recording this? Newton's voice rose an octave. The restaurant has security cameras, Jimin replied smoothly. But that's not what I'm talking about. He gestured subtly toward the other diners, many of whom were now openly watching, phones in hand. The question is, do you want to continue making a scene, or would you prefer to leave quietly? Newton stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, Deborah thought he might lunge at Jimin, but something in the other man's steady gaze made him hesitate. The entire restaurant had gone silent again, but this time the atmosphere was different. This time, someone had spoken up. This isn't over, Newton spat, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. But his hands were shaking, and everyone could see it. Actually, it is, Jimin said, his voice carrying across the room with quiet finality. If you contact Deborah again, through any means, those cameras will find their way to your employer, the police, and every news outlet in Seoul. Do you understand? Newton's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed toward the exit, nearly colliding with a server in his haste to leave. The silence that followed felt surreal. Deborah sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Her mind kept replaying the moment Newton's hand had released her wrist, the fear in his eyes, the way this stranger had simply made him leave. Jimin turned to her, his expression softening. Are you hurt? Deborah looked down at her wrist, already seeing the red marks where Newton's fingers had been. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. 2 years of suffocation, of walking on eggshells, of slowly disappearing, it all seemed to crash over her at once. She started, her voice breaking. I don't understand. Who are you? Jimin lowered himself into the chair Newton had vacated, maintaining a respectful distance. Someone who knows what it's like to feel powerless, he said quietly. And someone who decided that tonight, you wouldn't be alone anymore. If Deborah's story is resonating with you, don't go anywhere. This is just the beginning of her transformation. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment below if you've ever witnessed someone stand up for another person the way Jimin did. Your engagement helps stories like this reach people who need to hear them most. The apartment Jimin arranged for Deborah was nothing like the gilded cage she'd shared with Newton. It was smaller, quieter, tucked away in a neighborhood where nobody knew her name or her history. The morning light filtered through sheer curtains, falling across hardwood floors that didn't carry the weight of 2 years' worth of arguments and apologies that meant nothing. Deborah stood in the center of the empty living room 3 days after the restaurant incident, a single suitcase at her feet containing everything she'd managed to grab while Newton was at work. Jimin had sent 2 of his associates to help her silent, efficient men who'd stood guard while she'd thrown clothes and toiletries into bags with shaking hands, always listening for the sound of Newton's car in the driveway. She'd left behind the jewelry he'd given her, the designer handbags, the expensive dresses he'd chosen. She'd left behind everything except her sketchbooks, buried at the bottom of her suitcase like contraband. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jimin. The locksmith will arrive at 2 p.m. New phone arriving tomorrow, different number. Take your time settling in. Deborah sank onto the floor, her back against the bare wall, and let herself cry. Not the silent, swallowed tears she'd perfected over the past 2 years, but deep, shuddering sobs that felt like they were being pulled from somewhere beneath her ribs. She cried for the time she'd lost, for the woman she'd been before Newton, for the friends she'd stopped calling back, for her mother's worried voice on the phone asking if everything was okay when everything was so far from okay. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled out her old sketchbook, the one from before Newton had declared her art a waste of time and attention-seeking. The pages were filled with bold strokes and vibrant colors, a visual language she'd almost forgotten how to speak. Her fingers traced the outline of a self-portrait she'd drawn 3 years ago, a woman with fire in her eyes and confidence in every line. She barely recognized herself. Over the following weeks, Deborah learned to navigate the strange new landscape of freedom. Jimin checked in regularly, but never intrusively a text in the morning, an offer of dinner that she could accept or decline without explanation, a business card for a therapist who specialized in domestic abuse survivors. He never asked for anything in return, never made her feel indebted, never showed up unannounced. It was so different from Newton's suffocating presence that sometimes she found herself waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it never did. One evening, 6 weeks after the restaurant, Jimin took her to an art supply store in Insadong. Deborah had mentioned, almost casually, that she'd been thinking about painting again. She hadn't expected him to remember, much less to act on it. "Pick whatever you need," he said, gesturing at the rows of canvases, paints, and brushes that stretched toward the ceiling. "Don't think about the cost." Deborah walked through the aisles in a daze, her fingers hovering over tubes of cadmium red and ultramarine blue, her heart racing with a feeling she'd almost forgotten excitement. She selected brushes with the reverence of someone handling sacred objects, tested the weight of different canvases, breathed in the familiar smell of linseed oil and turpentine. At the register, as Jimin pulled out his card without hesitation, she finally found her voice. "Why are you doing this? All of this?" He looked at her with those steady, dark eyes that had first seen through Newton's facade. "My mother," he said quietly, "spent 15 years with a man who told her she was worthless. By the time she found the courage to leave, she'd forgotten who she was without him. She died 3 years later, never having recovered that lost part of herself." He paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I swore I'd never watch someone disappear like that again if I could do something about it." The revelation hung between them as they carried the supplies to his car. Deborah understood then that this wasn't about pity or obligation or even attraction. This was about Jimin fighting a battle he'd lost once before, trying to rewrite an ending he couldn't change. Back at her apartment, Deborah set up a makeshift studio in the corner of her living room. That night, for the first time in 2 years, she painted. The canvas came alive with dark blues and sudden bursts of gold, a storm breaking, a dawn emerging. Her hand moved with a confidence she thought Newton had stolen permanently, but it had only been sleeping, waiting. Around midnight, she stepped back to look at what she'd created. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were slightly off, the technique rusty from disuse. But it was hers, every brushstroke a small act of reclamation. Every color a word in a language she was remembering how to speak. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Jimin. "There's a gallery owner I know. If you're interested, I could make an introduction. No pressure, just a possibility." Deborah looked at the painting, at her reflection in the darkened window, at the future spreading out before her like a blank canvas waiting to be filled. For the first time in years, she felt the stirring of something dangerous and essential hope. She typed back, "I'd like that, thank you." 2 simple sentences, but they felt like a revolution. The gallery opening was supposed to be Deborah's triumph. 3 months of relentless work had culminated in this moment, 12 paintings displayed under carefully positioned lights, each one a testament to her resurrection. Art critics mingled with collectors, wine glasses catching the glow of the exhibition lights. And Deborah stood in the center of it all, wearing a dress she'd chosen herself, her natural hair styled in a crown of curls that Newton had always insisted she straighten. She was explaining the inspiration behind her centerpiece, a phoenix rendered in golds and crimsons, when she felt it. That familiar prickle at the back of her neck, the sixth sense she'd developed over 2 years of walking on eggshells. She turned, and there he was. Newton stood just inside the gallery entrance, his suit immaculate, his smile dangerous. He looked exactly as he had 3 months ago, except for his eyes. They held something darker now, wounded pride mixed with cold determination. Deborah's hand tightened around her wine glass. The room seemed to tilt, all the confidence she'd painstakingly rebuilt, threatening to crumble like sand. Newton moved toward her with calculated ease, nodding politely at the other guests as if he belonged here, as if he had every right to walk back into her life. "Deborah," he said, his voice loud enough to carry, "your work is surprising. I never knew you had this in you." The words were designed to cut, to remind her of every time he'd dismissed her art as frivolous, every time he'd made her feel small. Several guests glanced over, curiosity flickering across their faces. "You need to leave," Deborah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You're not welcome here." Newton's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here as a guest, just like everyone else. It's a public event, isn't it?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We need to talk. About us. About the mistakes you've made." "There is no us," Deborah said, taking a deliberate step back. "And the only mistake I made was staying with you as long as I did." Something flickered across Newton's face, genuine surprise that she would dare speak to him this way, especially in public. His hand shot out, gripping her elbow. "Don't make a scene," he hissed. "You're embarrassing yourself. Let go of her." Jimin's voice cut through the murmur of the gallery like a blade through silk. He materialized beside them, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was flanked by two men Deborah recognized, the same associates who'd helped her move out 3 months ago. They stood at a respectful distance, but their meaning was clear. Newton's hand dropped from Deborah's arm, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he straightened, squaring his shoulders in a pathetic attempt to match Jimin's authority. "This is between me and my girlfriend," he said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "You have no right." "She's not your girlfriend," Jimin interrupted, his tone conversational but laced with steel. "She hasn't been for months, and you were explicitly warned about the consequences of contacting her." "Warned?" Newton's laugh was brittle. "Who do you think you are? You can't just threaten me and expect." "I don't make threats," Jimin said quietly. "I make promises." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and held it up. Newton's face went slack as he saw whatever was displayed. Deborah couldn't see the screen, but she watched the color drain from Newton's face just as it had that night in the restaurant. "That's..." Newton's voice cracked. "You can't..." "Your board of directors received an anonymous package this morning," Jimin continued, his voice never rising above that same calm, measured tone. "Security footage from multiple sources, witness testimonies, a detailed timeline of your behavior. They're convening an emergency meeting on Monday." He paused, letting the information sink in. "Your father tried to suppress it. He failed." The gallery had gone quiet. Guests pretended to study paintings while openly eavesdropping. The gallery owner hovered near the entrance, phone in hand, clearly ready to call security if needed. Newton's composure shattered. "You bastard!" he spat, lunging forward. "You've ruined..." Deborah's voice rang out before Jimin's associates could move. "No." The single word stopped Newton in his tracks. He turned to her, and for the first time, Deborah saw him clearly not as the man who controlled her life, but as what he truly was, a small, insecure person who needed to diminish others to feel powerful. "You ruined yourself," Deborah said, her voice steady and clear. "Every time you raised your hand, every time you isolated me from my friends, every time you made me believe I was worthless." She took a step forward, and Newton actually flinched. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. I'm not your victim. I'm not your anything." Around them, guests had stopped pretending not to watch. Phones were out, recording. The gallery owner had appeared at Deborah's side, her expression fierce and protective. Newton looked around wildly, realizing he was surrounded by witnesses, by cameras, by people who would never unsee this moment. His face twisted with impotent rage, but beneath it, Deborah saw something else, the dawning realization that he'd lost. Not just her, but the image he'd so carefully cultivated, the power he'd wielded like a weapon. "This isn't over," he said, but the words were hollow. "Yes," Jimin said softly. "It is. Security has your photo. The police have been notified about your violation of the restraining order. If you're still here in 60 seconds, you'll leave in handcuffs." He glanced at his watch. 55 seconds. Newton stood frozen for a heartbeat longer, his mouth opening and closing uselessly. Then, with a final look of pure hatred, he turned and fled the gallery, the door slamming behind him with a finality that seemed to echo through the space. The silence that followed lasted only a moment before the gallery erupted in a wave of supportive murmurs. The gallery owner squeezed Deborah's shoulder. An older woman she didn't know nodded approvingly. A young couple raised their glasses in a subtle toast. Deborah's legs felt weak, adrenaline draining from her system. Jimin steadied her with a gentle hand on her arm. "You didn't need me," he said quietly. "You stood up for yourself." "I needed to know someone had my back," Deborah replied, her voice thick with emotion. That made all the difference. She looked around the gallery at her paintings, at the supportive faces, at the future she'd reclaimed stroke by stroke. Newton was gone. Not just from the gallery, but from her life, from her story. She was the author now. For the first time in years, Deborah felt completely, utterly free. Can we just take a moment to appreciate Deborah's strength right there? If you're rooting for her transformation as much as I am, show some love by hitting that like button. It takes 2 seconds, but means the world to this channel. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done in Deborah's situation? Have you ever had to find the courage to stand up to someone who tried to diminish you? Share your story below. This community is built on supporting each other, and your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The weeks following the gallery opening unfolded with a lightness Deborah had forgotten existed. She woke each morning without the knot of anxiety in her stomach, without the mental calculations of how to avoid conflict, without the exhausting performance of being someone she wasn't. The absence of fear, she discovered, left room for everything else: joy, curiosity, anger at the time she'd lost, and most surprisingly, forgiveness for herself. Her paintings sold. Not all of them, but enough that the gallery owner called with an offer for a second show. Deborah stood in her apartment, phone pressed to her ear, and cried happy tears that felt entirely foreign and completely right. 6 months from now, the gallery owner was saying, we're thinking a bigger space, more ambitious pieces. What do you say? Yes, Deborah said, laughing through her tears. God, yes. She called her mother that afternoon, something she'd been building courage to do for weeks. The conversation was difficult, her mother's voice breaking when Deborah finally explained what the past 2 years had really been like. The long silences filled with regret and relief in equal measure. I should have known, her mother said. I should have pushed harder when you stopped visiting. He was good at hiding it, Deborah replied, staring out her window at the Seoul skyline. I was good at hiding it too, but I'm done hiding now. They talked for 2 hours, making plans for her mother to visit, rebuilding bridges that Newton had systematically burned. When Deborah hung up, she felt lighter, as if she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Jimin invited her to dinner that evening at a small restaurant tucked away in Bucheon, the kind of place with no sign and only a handful of tables. They sat by a window overlooking the traditional hanok houses, the modern city glittering in the distance, a perfect metaphor, Deborah thought, for the intersection of past and present, of who she'd been and who she was becoming. You seem different, Jimin observed, pouring her tea with the precise movements of someone who'd grown up learning the ceremony. Settled, somehow. I talked to my mom today, Deborah said. Really talked to her. I haven't done that in years. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Newton convinced me that my family was the problem, that they didn't understand me. But he was the one isolating me, cutting me off from anyone who might have helped me see clearly. Jimin nodded, his expression understanding. Abusers are excellent architects. They build walls so gradually that you don't realize you're in a prison until someone shows you the door. You showed me the door, Deborah said quietly. But I had to walk through it myself. That's the only way it works, Jimin replied. I could remove the immediate threat, provide resources, create space. But the decision to reclaim your life, that was always yours. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the intimacy of shared understanding more profound than words. Deborah watched Jimin, this enigmatic man who'd appeared in her darkest moment like something out of a story. She knew his reputation, had heard whispers about his business dealings, the power he wielded in Seoul's shadows. But she also knew his gentleness, his patience, the way he'd never once made her feel obligated or owned. Can I ask you something? Deborah said finally. About your mother. Jimin's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Of course. You said she never recovered the part of herself she'd lost. But do you think... Deborah paused, choosing her words carefully. Do you think she had moments of peace? Before the end? Jimin was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. I'd like to think so, he said eventually. She started gardening in those last years, spent hours tending to orchids. I'd find her in the greenhouse, and sometimes she'd be smiling. He looked at Deborah directly. I think she was trying. I think she wanted to find her way back. She just ran out of time. I won't run out of time, Deborah said, the words both a promise and a declaration. I'm going to live loudly, paint fearlessly, love without terror. Everything he tried to take from me, I'm taking back. Something shifted in Jimin's expression, pride, perhaps, or recognition. You already are. The following weeks brought a rhythm Deborah had never experienced. Productive, peaceful, purposeful. She painted every day, sometimes for hours, losing herself in color and form the way she had before Newton. She reconnected with old friends, enduring their awkward apologies and accepting their genuine relief that she'd escaped. She started therapy, unpacking years of trauma with a professional who didn't judge, didn't rush, simply held space for her healing. One evening, she stood in front of her easel, working on a new piece, a woman emerging from water, her face tilted toward light. It was different from her earlier work, less about the storm and more about the emergence, the transformation that came after survival. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number made her breath catch for a moment, old instincts dying hard, but it was just a former colleague from before Newton, someone who'd seen the gallery coverage and wanted to reconnect. Deborah realized, with startling clarity, that she'd been holding her breath for weeks, waiting for Newton to reappear, for the other shoe to drop, for the piece to shatter. But it hadn't. The restraining order held. Jimin's influence had ensured that Newton faced real consequences, a forced resignation, social exile, the loss of everything he'd valued. But more than that, Deborah understood something fundamental. Even if Newton tried to return, she would never be that frightened, diminished woman again. She'd found her voice, her strength, her unwillingness to accept less than she deserved. She texted Jimin, "I'm not afraid anymore. Not of him, not of being alone, not of failing. I think I'm actually happy." His response came quickly. "You were always capable of this. You just needed to remember." Deborah set down her phone and returned to her painting, adding bold strokes of gold to the emerging figure's outstretched hands. The woman in the painting wasn't reaching for rescue. She was reaching for herself, for the life that had always been waiting on the other side of fear. Outside, Seoul glittered in the gathering dusk, full of possibility and promise. Deborah smiled, her brush moving with confidence across the canvas, writing her new story in colors that Newton could never dim. 6 months after the gallery opening, Deborah stood in a community center in Gangnam, watching women file into the room with the same haunted expressions she'd once worn. Some came alone, shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. Others were brought by friends or family members who hovered nearby, protective and worried. All of them carried the invisible weight of abuse, the exhaustion of constantly calculating danger. "Thank you for coming," Deborah said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I know how hard it is to be here. 6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined standing in front of you like this, but here we are." The idea had come to her gradually, born from conversations with her therapist and late-night talks with Jimin about how to transform pain into purpose. She'd approached the community center with a proposal. Art therapy workshops for domestic violence survivors. A space where women could express what words couldn't capture, where they could begin to see themselves as more than their trauma. Jimin had helped secure funding, connecting her with organizations he supported quietly, away from the spotlight. He'd also introduced her to legal advocates, shelter coordinators, and counselors who could provide resources she couldn't. But the vision, the heart of it, that was entirely Deborah's. "Art saved my life," she continued, gesturing to the supplies arranged on tables, canvases, paints, charcoal, clay. "Not because I'm particularly talented, but because it gave me a way to remember who I was before someone tried to erase me. This space is for you to remember too, or to discover who you're becoming." A young woman in the front row, maybe 22, with a scarf wrapped strategically around her neck, raised a trembling hand. "What if we don't know how to paint?" Deborah smiled gently. "Then you'll learn. And if you never get good at it, that doesn't matter. This isn't about creating masterpieces. It's about creating space for yourself in a life where someone has been taking up all the room." Over the next 2 hours, the community center transformed. Hesitant brushstrokes became bolder. Quiet conversations evolved into shared stories. A woman in her 50s painted abstract storms in grays and blacks, then deliberately splashed red across the canvas, a slash of defiance. The young woman with the scarf created a self-portrait with eyes too large for her face, as if she were learning to see again. Deborah moved between them, offering encouragement, sharing techniques, mostly just bearing witness. She saw herself in each of them, the woman who apologized for taking up space, the one who kept checking her phone nervously, the one whose hands shook when she picked up the brush. At the end of the session, several women lingered, reluctant to leave the safety of the room. One approached Deborah with tears streaming down her face, holding her painting, a bird with one wing extended, the other still folded. I'm not ready to fly yet, she said. But maybe someday. Someday, Deborah agreed, squeezing her hand. And until then, you're here. You showed up. That's everything. After the women left, Deborah began cleaning up, organizing supplies for the next session. Jimin appeared in the doorway, having kept a respectful distance during the workshop. He surveyed the room, the paintings drying on tables, the scattered brushes, the energy that still seemed to hum in the air. You did something important here today, he said. Deborah looked around the space, thinking about the women who'd walked through the door carrying impossible weights. They did the important thing. They chose to show up for themselves. I just held the door open. Like I did for you, Jimin said quietly. Like you did for me, Deborah acknowledged. She walked over to him, no longer the broken woman from the restaurant, but someone entirely new, forged through pain. Yes, but defined by her choice to transform it. And now I get to pay it forward. Over and over again. They stood together in the fading light, the community center windows reflecting the city beyond. Deborah thought about Newton sometimes, not with fear anymore, but with a strange, distant pity. He'd tried to destroy her, and had instead given her a purpose more profound than anything she could have imagined. Every woman she helped was a repudiation of everything he'd believed about power and control. The gallery called, Deborah said. They want to feature some of the work from these sessions in my next show, with the artist's permission, of course. Proceeds would go to domestic violence charities. Jimin's smile was genuine, reaching his eyes. Your mother would be proud. She is proud, Deborah corrected. She told me yesterday. She's volunteering at a women's shelter now, actually. Says I inspired her. She shook her head, marveling at the ripples that kept expanding outward from that single moment of intervention. All because you stood up in a restaurant. All because you were worth standing up for, Jimin replied. You always were. You just needed to believe it. As they left the community center, Deborah paused to look back at the space, at the paintings still drying, at the promise of next week's session, at the future being built, one brushstroke at a time. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, about the woman she was now, about all the women she'd helped become themselves again. The night air was cool against her skin, the city alive with possibility. Deborah took a deep breath, feeling it fill her lungs completely, no constriction, no fear, no apology for taking up space. She was free. And now, she would help others find their freedom too. That, she realized, was how you turned survival into purpose. How you made sure the pain meant something. How you wrote an ending so powerful it became someone else's beginning. Deborah smiled, linking her arm through Jimin's as they walked into the Seoul night, toward whatever came next. She was ready for all of it. Deborah's journey from victim to survivor to advocate shows us that our darkest moments don't define us, what we do after them does. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about how we can show up for others, please subscribe to this channel. We share stories of resilience, transformation, and the power of human connection every week. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and let me know in the comments, what was the most powerful moment in Deborah's story for you? Was it Jimin's intervention? Deborah finding her voice? Or her decision to help others? I read every single comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of a community that believes in second chances and the power of standing up for what's right. I'll see you in the next story.